I knew the HOA was bad, but I never expected them to bring in a bulldozer. I was at work when it happened. My phone buzzed with a text from my neighbor, followed by a blurry photo. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, then another message came in. "They're tearing down your guest house. HOA ordered it. You need to get here now." I practically ran out of my office, ignoring my boss yelling after me. By the time I made it home, my stomach was in knots. And then I saw it. What used to be my fully permitted, legally built guest house was now nothing but a pile of rubble. A bulldozer was still idling nearby, and a few HOA board members stood off to the side, looking very pleased with themselves. Front and center was the queen of the HOA herself, Margaret Olson, a middle-aged terror wrapped in pastel cardigans and fake superiority. She turned to me with that condescending tone she always used. "Oh, Daniel, I'm so glad you're here. We had to take action. Your guest house was in violation of HOA policy. You were warned." Warned? The only thing I'd ever received was a ridiculous letter claiming my guest house was unauthorized despite the fact that I had permits from the city. I had responded with proof, but clearly that didn't matter to Margaret and her power-hungry cronies. "You destroyed my property," I shouted, my fists clenched. "This was legal. This was my home." Margaret just sniffed. "We gave you time to comply and you refused." "The HOA has the authority. You have no such authority," I snapped, taking a step closer. "This was city-approved. You're going to pay for this." Margaret gave a smug little laugh. "Oh, Daniel, you can try, but the HOA has lawyers. You wouldn't stand a chance in court." That was the moment I knew I wasn't just going to fight back, I was going to make her and the entire HOA regret this. I took a deep breath, forcing myself not to do something impulsive. "Fine," I said, voice steady. "You want to play dirty, let's play." Margaret barely paid me any attention as she turned to leave, already gloating in her victory. But what she didn't know was that I had a plan forming, and it was going to be bigger than she could ever imagine. If the HOA thought they could just bulldoze my home and get away with it, they were about to learn the hard way just how wrong they were. I didn't waste time arguing with Margaret any further. Standing there, fuming, wouldn't fix what had been done. I needed action, and I needed it fast. The destruction of my guest house wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an illegal act, one that the HOA had no authority to carry out. The fact that Margaret and her board thought they could get away with it told me one thing. They had done this before, and no one had ever challenged them hard enough to make them pay for it. That was about to change. I walked past the debris that used to be my guest house without looking back. I wasn't going to waste my energy on grief, not yet. Instead, I went straight into my main house, grabbed my laptop, and started gathering every single document I had. Permits, approvals, emails with the city, even the blueprints. Every piece of evidence proving that my guest house was legal went into a single folder. Next, I made a few calls. The first one was to an attorney. I didn't need just any lawyer, I needed someone who specialized in property law and had a history of dealing with corrupt HOAs. After a few referrals from friends, I found my guy. He listened carefully as I explained what had happened, and his response was exactly what I needed to hear. "They messed up badly, and you have a rock-solid case," he said. "We'll hit them with everything we've got." That was the first step. The second was making sure everyone knew exactly what had happened. I reached out to local news stations, making sure they got the full story. A homeowner's legally built guest house being bulldozed by an overreaching HOA. That was the kind of thing that got attention. Within hours, reporters were calling me back, asking for interviews, but I wasn't done yet. I started talking to my neighbors, learning more about how the HOA had treated others. What I found out sickened me. Margaret and her board had been running the HOA like their personal kingdom for years. They issued arbitrary fines, manipulated records, and even forced some homeowners to sell when they couldn't keep up with the ridiculous fees. And no one had been able to stop them until now. With all this ammunition, I was ready to strike. But I needed one more thing, a place to stay. And that's when inspiration hit me. The HOA had a private parking garage attached to their office building. It was a luxury they had built for themselves, using HOA funds, of course. Homeowners weren't allowed to use it, but the board members had their own personal spots inside. It was time to turn the tables. I drove down to City Hall the next morning, armed with paperwork. I requested a full review of the HOA's property usage. If my legally approved guest house had been deemed a violation, then I was going to make sure every single thing the HOA had done was scrutinized. The results were better than I could have hoped. It turned out that the parking garage itself was in violation of zoning laws. The HOA had built it without the proper permits, assuming no one would ever challenge them. And since they had used community funds for an unauthorized structure, that meant it technically belonged to all homeowners, including me. I wasted no time filing a claim against the HOA. My lawyer helped me set the legal wheels in motion, but I took it a step further. I moved in. I brought in a cot, a small fridge, and some essentials. If the HOA was going to deny me my home, I was going to make myself comfortable in theirs. The first day, Margaret and the other board members barely noticed. But by the second day, once they realized I had taken over their precious parking garage, they were furious. Margaret stormed in, her face red with indignation. "Daniel, you can't be here," she snapped. "This is private property." I leaned back in my chair, completely at ease. "Actually, it's not. This was built with community funds, and since you destroyed my residence, I have every right to use shared spaces." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She wasn't used to being challenged this directly. "You have 24 hours to leave," she finally managed. Or else what?" I asked casually. "You'll bulldoze this too. I'd love to see you try." Margaret's glare could have melted steel, but I wasn't intimidated. I had the law on my side, the media watching, and now the entire neighborhood rallying behind me. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every homeowner who had suffered under the HOA's rule, and I wasn't going anywhere. Margaret's fury was almost comical. She stood rigid, her perfectly manicured nails digging into her clipboard as she tried to process what was happening. The other HOA board members hovered behind her, exchanging anxious glances. None of them had ever been challenged like this before, and it was clear they had no immediate strategy to deal with me. I had thrown them completely off balance. Margaret's confidence wavered for the first time. She was used to barking orders and watching people scramble to obey. But I wasn't backing down. In fact, I was settling in. I had already arranged my cot in the corner of the parking garage, right next to an electrical outlet where I had plugged in a small fan. A portable cooler sat beside me, stocked with drinks and snacks. I wasn't trying to be comfortable. I was making a statement. Margaret finally seemed to regain control of herself. She straightened her shoulders and gestured sharply at the two board members flanking her. One, a wiry man named Greg, stepped forward, adjusting his glasses. "You're trespassing," Greg announced, though there was an uncertain edge to his voice. I held up a stack of documents. "Actually, I'm not. This structure was built using community funds, which means it belongs to all of us. And since my home was unlawfully destroyed, I needed somewhere to stay." "Convenient, isn't it?" Margaret's nostrils flared. "You can't just," she started, but I cut her off. "I already spoke with a lawyer. If you try to remove me, you'll be violating my rights. And considering the lawsuit I'm already filing for the destruction of my guest house, I doubt you want to add more legal trouble to your plate." Greg looked at Margaret, silently asking for direction. She clenched her jaw, clearly realizing that brute intimidation wouldn't work. "You won't be here for long," she snapped. "We'll see to that," I shrugged. "Go ahead, but while you're trying to figure out how to bend the rules in your favor, I'll be right here." Margaret turned sharply on her heel and strode out, her board members trailing behind like confused ducklings. I leaned back against the cool concrete wall and exhaled. The first battle had gone in my favor, but I knew Margaret wouldn't give up that easily. And I was right. The HOA tried their first counterattack the next morning. I woke up to the blaring sound of a car alarm. Sitting up quickly, I saw two HOA board members, Greg and another guy named Peter, pacing around the garage taking pictures. Margaret wasn't with them, but she didn't need to be. This was her handiwork. I stretched and stood, watching them with mild amusement. They were obviously trying to find anything they could use against me. Greg finally turned, clearing his throat. "We're issuing you a violation notice for," he glanced down at a clipboard, flipping through pages, "misuse of community property and unauthorized residency." I crossed my arms. "Interesting, and where is that in the HOA bylaws?" He hesitated. Peter shifted uncomfortably. "You're obstructing the intended use of this space," Greg tried again. I gestured around. "Nobody else is using it. And since the HOA office hours are limited, this space is empty most of the time. Seems like a waste, don't you think?" Peter muttered something under his breath, clearly frustrated. Greg straightened. "This is your final warning. You need to leave or we'll escalate this." I chuckled. "Go ahead, but I'd be careful with escalation. Remember, I have lawyers involved now, and I've already contacted local news outlets. They're very interested in this story." Greg paled slightly. I could see the wheels turning in his head. The last thing the HOA wanted was public scrutiny. Without another word, they turned and left, their plan clearly foiled. But Margaret wasn't done. By that afternoon, a tow truck had arrived. I spotted it from a distance as I was walking back from grabbing lunch at a nearby food truck. The driver was standing near the entrance, talking to none other than Margaret herself. She saw me approach and folded her arms with a triumphant expression. "You left your vehicle in an unauthorized location," she announced. "We're towing it." I checked my watch. "That's interesting because I parked in my designated spot, which, by the way, I still legally own as a homeowner." Margaret's smug expression flickered for a moment. "You abandoned it," she argued. "I went to get food," I corrected. "Is that a crime now?" The tow truck driver looked between us, clearly hesitant. He wasn't interested in stepping into the middle of a legal dispute. I pulled out my phone and started recording. "This is homeowner Daniel Carter, documenting yet another attempt by the HOA to overreach their authority. My vehicle is legally parked, and yet the HOA is trying to tow it without cause. This is harassment." The tow truck driver immediately stepped back. "I'm not getting involved in this," he muttered, shaking his head. He climbed back into his truck and drove off, leaving Margaret fuming. She turned on me, eyes blazing. "You think you're clever, don't you?" I smiled. "No, I just know my rights." She stormed away without another word. That night, I met with my lawyer to finalize the lawsuit. He assured me that we had a strong case, and once we filed, the HOA was going to have a serious legal battle on their hands. But I wasn't just aiming for compensation. I wanted Margaret and the entire corrupt board removed, and now I had the leverage to make that happen. Margaret wasn't just angry, she was desperate. The HOA had counted on me rolling over, accepting their destruction of my guest house as inevitable. They hadn't expected resistance. They certainly hadn't anticipated me turning their own parking garage into my personal residence. And now, with media attention growing and a lawsuit looming over their heads, they were scrambling. I could see it in the way the board members avoided eye contact when they passed by. The way Greg hesitated whenever he spoke, as if choosing his words carefully. Even Peter, usually arrogant and dismissive, had started looking nervous whenever my name was mentioned. But Margaret, she was doubling down. I woke up early the next morning, still in my makeshift setup within the garage, and found a notice taped to the wall beside me. It was printed on official HOA letterhead, full of legal jargon, but the message was clear. They were terminating my access to all HOA-managed amenities, effective immediately. That meant no access to the community pool, the gym, or the clubhouse, not that I used those much anyway. But more importantly, it included the parking garage. They were trying to force me out. I folded the notice neatly and tucked it into my backpack before heading out. I had an appointment with my lawyer that morning, and I wanted to make sure every single one of their moves was documented. If the HOA thought they could intimidate me with bureaucratic nonsense, they were in for a rude awakening. By the time I arrived at my lawyer's office, he already had a stack of papers waiting for me. "They're panicking," he said, flipping through pages. "They know they messed up, and now they're throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks. But this latest stunt, it's not going to hold up." I took a seat across from him and scanned the documents. He had compiled every violation, every overreach, and every abuse of power the HOA had committed over the years, not just against me, but against multiple homeowners. "This is bigger than your guest house," he continued. "We have enough here to push for a full HOA audit." That caught my attention. An audit meant exposing everything. If Margaret and her cronies had been skimming funds, mismanaging budgets, or approving shady deals, it would all come to light. And given what I had already uncovered, I was willing to bet they had plenty to hide. "How do we make it happen?" I asked. "We file a formal request with the city," he explained. "But more importantly, we rally the homeowners. If enough people demand transparency, the HOA won't be able to sweep this under the rug." I left his office with a renewed sense of purpose. It was time to take this fight to the next level. That afternoon, I went door to door throughout the neighborhood, talking to homeowners. The more I spoke with them, the more I realized just how deep the HOA's corruption ran. People had been hit with sudden fines for non-existent violations. Others had been strong-armed into expensive, mandatory renovations. A few had even been threatened with foreclosure if they didn't comply with arbitrary rules. And the worst part, most of them had been too afraid to fight back. But now, with my lawsuit in motion and public attention growing, they were starting to see that they had power too. By the end of the day, I had gathered signatures from over half the homeowners in the community, more than enough to demand an audit. I brought the petition to City Hall the next morning, filed the paperwork, and made sure the media was aware of it. If the HOA thought they could quietly weather this storm, they were about to find themselves in the center of an even bigger mess. Margaret must have gotten wind of what I was doing, because that evening she showed up at the parking garage herself. She wasn't alone. 2 uniformed security guards stood behind her, arms crossed, as she approached me with a tight-lipped expression. "Daniel," she said, her voice clipped. "You are in violation of HOA policies. You need to vacate this premises immediately." I leaned against my cot, arms folded. "You don't have the authority to evict me, Margaret. This garage was built with community funds. You don't own it." Her hands clenched at her sides. "You are obstructing the intended use of this space. We have hired security to ensure you comply with HOA regulations." I glanced at the 2 guards. They didn't look particularly invested in the situation. They were probably just hired muscle, brought in to intimidate me. "Let me guess," I said, turning back to her. "You're paying these guys with HOA funds too?" Margaret's expression darkened. "You're making a fool of yourself," she hissed. "You think this little stunt will win you sympathy? You're just proving that you're a troublemaker." I smiled. "Funny." "That's what people say when they're losing," she exhaled sharply. "This is your last warning. If you don't leave by tomorrow morning, we will press charges for trespassing." I pulled out my phone and started recording. "Say that again, Margaret. I want to make sure I have it on record." Her mouth snapped shut. She wasn't stupid. She knew that any legal action against me would bring even more scrutiny onto the HOA. Instead, she turned on her heel and stormed out, the security guards following after her. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of drilling. I sat up instantly, heart pounding, and saw workers at the entrance of the garage. They were installing new metal gates, thick, reinforced ones that looked like they belonged in a prison. Margaret was standing nearby, overseeing the work with a satisfied expression. I walked up to her, keeping my voice calm. "What exactly are you doing?" She didn't even look at me. "Ensuring the security of HOA property. Once these gates are in place, access will be restricted to approved personnel only." I clenched my jaw. She was trying to trap me inside, turning the garage into a cage. But what she didn't realize was that I had anticipated something like this. I had already packed my things the night before and moved them to a storage unit. My setup had been temporary. I never intended to stay in the garage long term. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of the new gates before heading straight to my lawyer's office. By the time I arrived, he was already on the phone with city officials. The HOA had made another crucial mistake. They didn't get a permit for the gates, he said, shaking his head. And since this is technically a shared community structure, they can't just restrict access without a vote. Margaret had overplayed her hand. That same afternoon, city inspectors arrived at the HOA office, demanding to see their permits. When they couldn't produce them, the order was given. The gates had to come down. I made sure to be there when the workers dismantled the metal barriers, watching as Margaret stood off to the side, visibly seething. I leaned in just enough for her to hear me. "Nice try." She didn't respond. She just turned and walked away. She knew it. I was winning. Margaret was unraveling. The gates had been torn down, my lawsuit was moving forward, and the city was now actively investigating the HOA's finances. Every attempt the board had made to shut me down had backfired spectacularly, and now they were running out of ways to fight back. But Margaret wasn't the type to go down quietly. If anything, the more desperate she became, the more reckless her decisions got, and that was exactly what would be her undoing. I had barely been awake an hour when my lawyer called. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it. The HOA had filed an emergency motion against me. They were claiming that my lawsuit was frivolous, demanding it be thrown out before it ever saw a courtroom. Worse, they had somehow convinced a judge to fast-track the hearing. Instead of months down the line, we were now looking at a court date in less than a week. I wasn't surprised. Margaret had connections in the city council, and she had likely pulled in a few favors to get the hearing expedited. She wanted this over before it could gain more traction, before more homeowners realized just how deep the corruption went. What she didn't know was that I had been preparing for this exact scenario. The moment I got off the phone, I went straight to work. I reviewed every document, every piece of evidence, making sure there were no gaps in our case. I reached out to the homeowners who had signed the petition, ensuring they were ready to testify. My lawyer and I worked through every possible argument the HOA might throw at us, crafting airtight responses. By the time the hearing day arrived, I was ready. The courtroom was packed. HOA board members sat stiffly in the front row, their expressions carefully neutral, but I could see the tightness around their eyes. They were nervous. Margaret sat among them, her posture rigid, her fingers gripping the edge of the table just a little too tightly. The judge entered, a sharp-eyed woman who wasted no time getting to the point. The HOA's lawyer stood first, launching into a rehearsed speech about how my lawsuit was baseless, how I was a troublemaker looking for a payout, how I had disregarded community standards. It was all nonsense, and they knew it. When it was my lawyer's turn, he didn't waste time with theatrics. He laid out the facts plainly and methodically. He presented the permits proving my guest house was legal. He showed photographs of the demolition, emphasizing that no approval had ever been given for such an action. He submitted financial records that suggested mismanagement of HOA funds, and then the real bombshell. Homeowners began taking the stand, one by one, sharing their experiences. One woman spoke about how the HOA had fined her for minor infractions until she was forced to sell her home. An elderly couple described how they had been pressured into paying for unnecessary renovations under the threat of foreclosure. A man revealed that the HOA had quietly increased fees over the years without proper votes, funneling money into projects that only benefited board members. The judge listened carefully, her expression unreadable. Then, she turned to the HOA's lawyer. "Do you have any documented evidence refuting these claims?" The lawyer hesitated. "We believe these are exaggerated accounts," the judge cut him off. "Belief is not evidence. Either you have documentation proving your actions were lawful or you don't." Silence. Margaret shifted uncomfortably, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. The judge didn't immediately rule in my favor, but she did something just as devastating to the HOA. She refused to dismiss the case. Instead, she ordered a full forensic audit of the HOA's finances and governance. It was the worst possible outcome for Margaret. The moment the hearing ended, she stormed out of the courtroom, her board members scrambling to keep up. I didn't need to hear what she was saying to know that she was furious. I stepped outside, taking in the crisp air. The community was finally getting the accountability it deserved. And Margaret? She had no idea just how much worse things were about to get. The moment the judge ordered the forensic audit, Margaret knew the game was over. She didn't say a word as she left the courtroom, but the way her jaw was clenched and her shoulders were set like stone told me everything I needed to know. She was barely holding it together, but it wasn't over yet. I spent the next few weeks watching the HOA unravel in real time. The audit team wasted no time digging into the financial records, and it didn't take long for the skeletons to come tumbling out. Misallocated funds, unauthorized expenses, and even outright missing money all started surfacing. Homeowners who had previously been afraid to speak up now had proof that Margaret and her board had been exploiting them for years. The city officials overseeing the audit weren't pleased, and neither were the residents. The more people learned, the angrier they became. Then the final blow landed. One evening, I got a call from my lawyer. His voice had a rare note of satisfaction. "They found something big," he said. "The HOA wasn't just mismanaging funds." Margaret and a few of the board members were funneling money into personal accounts under the guise of maintenance costs. They've been embezzling from the community for years. I let out a breath. Enough to press charges? More than enough. The city is getting involved now. And with the lawsuit still active, you're looking at a very strong case for damages. The fallout was immediate. The very next day, city investigators arrived at the HOA office, accompanied by law enforcement. Margaret was there, trying to maintain her usual icy composure. But the second they presented her with paperwork detailing the financial crimes, her expression cracked. I wasn't inside, but neighbors who had gathered outside the office later told me she had tried to argue, claiming everything was a misunderstanding. It didn't work. The officers escorted her out of the building, placing her in the back of a squad car as homeowners stared in stunned silence. It wasn't just Margaret. Greg and Peter were also taken into custody, both of them looking pale and shaken as they were led away. The entire HOA board was effectively dismantled in a single day. But the best part. Since the HOA had bulldozed my guest house without any legal authority, and since the board had been found guilty of financial misconduct, the court ruled in my favor. Not only did they have to pay for every cent of the damages, but I was awarded a hefty settlement on top of it. With the HOA in shambles, the remaining residents took action. A community vote was held, and by an overwhelming majority, the HOA was dissolved entirely. For the first time in years, the neighborhood was finally free. With my settlement money, I rebuilt my guest house bigger and better than before. But this time, I wasn't just building for myself. I hosted a celebration for the entire community, a symbolic moment marking the end of an era of corruption and the beginning of something better. As I stood in my newly rebuilt space, watching my neighbors laugh and enjoy themselves without fear of arbitrary fines or power-hungry board members, I knew I had won more than just a legal battle. I had taken back my home, and in the process, I had helped my entire neighborhood do the same.